Before I start my speech, I would like to define some stuff. So we define a military coup as a military power that deposes the current government of the country. So I think the main goal of this debate is to preserve democracy, peace, and alleviate human suffering, and whichever team fulfills these should win the debate. So for my first point, this House strongly believes that the integrity of a democratic election is to be respected. By forcibly deposing a government, you are disregarding the politicians that the people have voted into office. The ability to vote is a human right, and therefore by simply removing the politicians that the people of Niger have voted for is violating the rights of every single citizen of their country. For my second point, is that power should be held by the most qualified individuals, not those that possess the largest brute strength. By allowing military commanders to be in charge of a nation's economy, their natural resources, and their businesses, I can already see a lot of things going wrong. In the case of Niger, they have removed all officials from the previous government and replaced them with less competent commanders from the military. This will severely impact Niger and their economy, as the country's many ministries are being led by people who are not qualified for that job. And also, to extend on this point, is that violence will be implicit within this new regime, because the leaders of the military coup, they had a problem because they wanted to become they wanted to lead the country, but then there's already a government leading the country. So they solved this problem by using violence to take over the government. So if these people solve their problems using violence, therefore I can say that this country encounters, they will solve this problem using violence. So therefore, violence will be implicit during the rule of this new leader. And for my third point is that if we allow someone to take down the government with little to no resistance and still allow them to replace the government, we will be telling all those potential coup leaders out there that taking down the government will lead to almost no resistance. By stopping these tyrants from taking power, we are not only protecting the people of Niger, but protecting the people of West Africa. Because in West African history, many nations had military coups in the past few decades. So by showing that such coups will be met with powerful opposition, this will act as the ultimate deterrent to potential coup leaders or organizers. So this is why I believe that the West African nations should intervene militarily. And so, yes.
If you consider the fact that there are many insurgencies in Niger currently, the fact that another invasion by ECOWAS would send more tanks, more guns, more soldiers into Niger, don't you think this would just add to the instability?
No, because these coups in Niger are not sanctioned by an actual government that sits in the United Nations. So because the armies led by a government will be much more organized, and they will adhere to the Geneva Convention so that they will not face the repercussions from the United Nations. A military coup in Niger is very different from foreign government intervention, because foreign government intervention will be more orderly, and I'm very sure they will take an effort to preserve the human rights of the people of Niger. And so, in conclusion, this House believes that a violent rise to power should always be denied. It is a clear violation of human rights and must be stopped. It has to be stopped not only for the good of the country suffering from the coup, but also for the surrounding countries, to show that a violent coup will be met with fierce resistance, and taking over a country in this manner will never be feasible. Thank you very much.
I think opening government does not actually frame the counterfactual coming from the opening opposition correctly. Opening opposition is also dealing with military issue, but not through economic organization, which is not even principally justified. They go on and tell us about how this type of economic organization can bring stability into the overall Niger as a whole. I think about how they just framing it incorrectly, because one, they actually need to guarantee why is this economic community of West Africa something unique to solving the issue, for example, the coup data. And I need to guarantee about how does the state can guarantee that such economic community of West Africa can actually ensure enough stability within the nation of Niger when they're literally themselves an economic organization. Opening opposition here today will prove to you why this intervention from an economic organization being not only bad for Niger, this country, but also bad to the African continent as a whole. I'll directly proceed to the framing and setting up the cases for opening opposition. Two pieces of framing. One, economic community of West Africa is more like a community that is deal with economic issue. To differentiate from other organizations, it does not function like European Union, but rather works as a cooperation and trade between nations in the African state as a whole. Our proposal alter coming from the opposition is that we're not getting the economic organization to intervene, but actually political organization to intervene. For example, African Union can directly deal with this, and the prop side need to prove the uniqueness of the economic organization in dealing such issue. I'll directly proceed to give a characterization about what would the impact of the war look like in the pro side. First of all, this will directly proceed into more tensions between the ECOWAS and other nations. The thing that will happen is because one, economic organization stands for as a trade organization between different unions. First of all, if the nation recognizes how this ECOWAS is intervening with this political behavior, they will fear that they will be also threatened domestically because they already see ECOWAS threatening another nation of their political issue too. If this scenario just continue in the proposition side, the people will also feel the fear that they will be threatened domestically, internally within a nation at the same time. Secondly, this will directly look at the African internal civil war in which the economic organization shouldn't even be intervening. Opposition side may say this issue is parallel on both sides. However, we say African Union is a justifiable factor into solving this issue because African Union stands for is an issue that can be dealing with political behaviors happening on this continent. However, ECOWAS is an economic organization. We do not see about how can this economic organization just intervene with one nation and solving their own political issue. Even if that's the case, we say about how this shouldn't even be the impact leaving for the economic organization in today's debate, and the provinces have never justified the uniqueness for such economic organization into today's round. And thirdly, I think this will directly turn to sovereignty issue because ECOWAS does not hold the natural accountability of letting another nation to follow their rules or follow their democratic elected government or something like that. This is directly turning from the sovereignty issue because our opponents is letting economic organization to deal with everything that is happening within the nation of Niger. We do now see how it can be the most unique solvency into today's debate. I'm moving to giving three-level analysis about why this is going to harm the African continent as a whole. In general, this is going to undermine the global trust of Africa. Because we already proved to you how about one, there's more tension between ECOWAS and other nations, and two, let's look at the African internal civil war in which an economic organization participate in the civil war, and therefore, as this economic community is intervening this member because of the political issue, we do not see about how this can rise over the trust of Africa towards of the world towards the Africa continent. They will simply view Africa continent as a continent who are trying to deal with political issue by letting economic organization to handle it. This directly means it can undermine the global trust of the African continent because none of the nation will trust such continents who let the economic organization to intervene with political issue can be freely trade and can also bring more benefits towards the nations themselves. This means about there can be purposes of reducing trade generally from the world to the Africa continent as a perspective. We say this action to letting ECOWAS to go against and tackle down the issue in Nigeria directly go against the initial purpose of the organization, and therefore people who are trying to join this economic organization are going to be feared to be intervened because they are fearing there can be the next Niger who is going to be intervened because of the internally domestic political issue. And right now, our opponent is simply just pushing such thing from ever happening. This means that there will also be a rising tension between the ECOWAS and other nations, nation in the African continent, and directly reduce the accountability of the trade that can be happening in the African continent, which we say this can reduce the global trust of Africa as a whole. Even if we go on, take up our analysis from our opponent's best case scenario, if ECOWAS is actually successful in counter down this coup, we say this is going to be something harmful because one, Niger is not even a part of ECOWAS. We do not see how ECOWAS can intervene a nation who is not even as member states in the union. And secondly, people are less likely to join this organization organization because it's going to deal with political issue. However, ECOWAS stands for economic organization, and we do not see the point to let it deal with a political issue. Therefore, even if the coup d'etat, even if the reformation that ECOWAS can propose is going to be successful, in our opponent's best case scenario, there will be less people who is going to join the ECOWAS organization because they do not want themselves to be intervened by the economic organization, which means the most direct consequences is about the separate economy could occur in Africa. However, such separating economy is actually something bad because one, in a separated economy, there's no capital cooperation and trade maximization product that can be produced, which means that on our opponent's side, there can be reduced amount of trades because the people do not want to join the ECOWAS, will simply just leave the union, and leaving this union means a less stabilized safety and the economy. This directly leads to the second analysis about why we say on our opponent's side they're going to harm the Africa continent as a whole, because each stable economy then means reducing chances of economic crisis. For example, in the previous crisis, the economic crisis, there are organizations that can be helping to tackle down this issue, and ECOWAS should be existing like this purpose, but not existing as a political organization, which means in a separated economy that is happening in the government side in today's debate, it's going to increase the chances of less stabilized economy and also less capital cooperation that can be proposing occurring in the opposition side, which means in our opponent side that can be undermining global interests happening in the African continent because of the intervention of the economic organization to a political issue, and also more separated economy because people thus believe ECOWAS is a political organization rather than an economic organization, and the fear of being intervened would directly lead them to quit such organization. However, in our side, by letting the help from the African Union, this can directly tackle down issue of political issue because African Union is a more justified political organization than the ECOWAS in today's debate. Our opponents need to prove the uniqueness of letting an economic organization to intervene with political issue in today's debate. That's very proud to oppose.
So I think the opening opposition has already lost this debate because they ultimately agree on the principle of military intervention. So we do not accept their extremely narrow framing of this debate of which actors should carry out the intervention. They are violating the very spirit of this motion, which is whether ECOWAS should intervene or should they not intervene. So I think the only point that is specific to their side is that they say that the intervention is a violation of Niger's sovereignty. So two layers of rebuttals. First, I think it's important to realize that sovereignty should only be respected when a legitimate government is in power. I think it's important to realize that ultimately sovereignty means respecting the wishes of a nation's people to govern themselves. In this case, Niger's military junta is illegitimate, and they took power not because of a democratic process, but because they used the military force to illegitimately unseat the democratically elected government in the first place. So intervention is completely justified. Secondly, even if Judge, you do agree that it's a violation of their sovereignty, I think we are willing to take this trade-off as long as we're actually freeing the people from a military dictatorship at the cost of like some arbitrary sovereignty violation. So moving on to my extension. So I think it is the responsibility of ECOWAS to intervene in Niger. So it's first important to establish that leaders of a military coup are essentially dictators. So two reasons why. Firstly, they have illegitimately obtained their power through a show or act of actual force to unseat a democratically elected government. And secondly, this was done without the consent or support of the normal citizens of Niger who had already voted the previous government into power. As a dictatorship, Niger's military junta have all the hallmarks of an authoritarian regime. That is, they are incentivized to oppress their people and dissenters because they're in power against the will of the Niger people themselves. Yes, what's your POI?
What would you say to the potentially thousands or tens of thousands of soldiers and civilians that could potentially die in this war instigated by ECOWAS?
So I think it's even worse if you just allow the dictatorship to fester in Niger. I think it's better that we solve the problem now by intervening military and stopping the dictatorship before it begins to form. And secondly, I think, as my first speaker has mentioned, that this issue extends not just to Niger, but to the whole global community. I think once ECOWAS shows that they are too cowardly to stop a dictatorship that's currently forming in Niger, I think it sends a message to the entire world, and specifically to dictators, that the world community is not willing to stand up for the democracy and actually enforce the democracy when it matters the most. I think this will encourage the rise of more dictatorships, more authoritarian regimes, more tyrants in the future. So moving on. So I think as the dictatorships, Niger's military junta, as I said before, have all the characteristics of like your run-of-the-mill authoritarian regime. That's they're incentivized to oppress their people and dissenters because they're in power against the will of the Niger people. So this would come in the form of propaganda, corruption, and human rights abuses to further their own agenda. So since the foundation of their power is built on the military and built on force, they have no incentive to fulfill the needs and demands of the ordinary citizen because they are not a democratic and illegitimate government. And with instead, the Niger military junta could do anything to keep themselves in control of the nation and to benefit themselves, not their people, as much as possible. I think this has two impacts. First, a reduction in the basic human rights of people living in Niger because they have no power over what their own government does. Their own government is not there to serve their own people. They are there to line their own pockets, to serve their own officials, to serve themselves. Secondly, I think this will cause an intensification of geopolitical rivalries and conflicts because a non-rational actor, in this case, the military junta, whose main interest is not peace and prosperity, but instead power and wealth, is in control of Niger. I think military governments are inherently more inclined to use power and force to resolve conflicts instead of diplomacy. Yes, what's your POI?
The bottom line is people in Niger are starving and losing their lives to military insurgency. Do you think that when this is the status quo, people care about democracy?
I think democracy is not the solution, but dictatorship is even worse. I think what happens in a dictatorship is that most democracies, they still have to fulfill the needs of their people because they depend on votes to become in power, right? If you don't follow what your people want, they will not vote for you. So what democracies have to do is, to some extent at least, they have to serve the people. They have to make the conditions better. I think in dictatorships, they do not care at all about their people because whether or not the people vote for them ultimately does not matter. Because as long as they have the military on their side, as long as they have tanks, they have guns, they can just simply kill any dissenters, put them down before they even like revolt or something. So I think we as a global community cannot and will not let this happen. ECOWAS, because of its proximity to Niger, is best equipped for this conflict. OG believes that a military intervention will work for two reasons. Firstly, Niger's military junta is calling the African community's bluff. As with all dictators, they believe that the international community is unwilling to actually do anything about their forceful takeover of the legitimate government. By actually committing to an intervention, Niger's junta is almost certainly going to step down because once the war is in full swing, their fight or flight response will have already been triggered. Since the intervention forces obviously have the numerical advantage and the backing of international powers, it is in the military government's best interest to simply surrender to the demands and avoid further punishment. Yes, what's your POI?
In your logically, if the political organization cannot work, why is it principally justifiable to like an economic organization to intervene with political issues?
I think you misunderstand. We are the ones advocating for military intervention. I think your whole framing of this debate is actually unfair in the first place because you're just reducing the debate as who should intervene, ECOWAS or like the African Union. I think this is not what the debate is about. It's about intervention or not. Thank you. So, Judge, this debate is extremely simple. On OG's side, we seek to prevent the spread of authoritarianism, tyranny, and dictatorship through showing that a united Africa will not stand for an illegitimate military-controlled government. If we, as an international community, allow Niger to wither and die in a dictatorship, as the opposition seems to advocate for, we set a dangerous precedent that ultimately the world is too cowardly to prevent the rise of dictatorships. For the sake of democracy and for the sake of justice, we implore you to vote for OG's.
ECOWAS is an economic organization, not a political organization. We don't think it can deal with a lot of political problems when ECOWAS is just aiming at economic community. So I'll please a clarification before we move on to anything. Firstly, we agree with the DPM that we don't want the military coup to be in power, which is why we need AU to solve the problem. Meaning more than 5 minutes the DPM speech elaborating how the military coup is bad is symmetric in either side of the house. All the House in today's debate don't just agree with that military coup is bad and we need the democratic government to be in chair, which is fine. The comparison is about the process, in which I'll be elaborating on that later. Secondly, their only response to all the framing and characterization my partner gives you was this debate was not about this. We think this debate comes from two layers. Firstly, whether to intervene or not. We think all House in today's debate agree to intervene because we don't want the military coup. But secondly, then, who is likely to intervene? We do not want ECOWAS to actually intervene because it's an economic organization which they have lack of lack of accountedness as to why this kind of economic organization are able to do this far better than the AU. But secondly, we think the AU is far better than doing those things because it's a political organization that can cover a lot of countries within this kind of organization. With that being said, let's do a comparative on the AU and ECOWAS as to how this kind of instrument from AU is just far more better than ECOWAS. First, in terms of feasibility of solving these issues, 3 layers of analysis. Firstly, ECOWAS is an economic organization in which its lack of experience at dealing with political issues and long-term existing political tension. The comparative is because AU is dealing the problems and understand the political tension and example, within this area, and therefore far more accurate policy to address this problem on the root. But secondly, ECOWAS' lack of inclusiveness, unlike the AU. Some African countries wasn't even in the ECOWAS anyway, and so for we think that AU just form powerful in holding all the political stability anyway. But thirdly, AU have more possibility and capability actually to solve this problem at the root. As a lot of large countries are within it and a lot of international connection with a lot of other international organizations within the world. We think via this way, AU has far more political power holding hand than ECOWAS to actually dealing with political problems, which we don't think that there's lack of analysis from open government as a whole as to how economic organizations are able to deal with political issues far more better than the political organization itself originally. Secondly, their basket scenario in which was ECOWAS are able to solve the problem. So the comparative became simple. It was on the consequences and also the process. 2 things to mention here then. Firstly, ECOWAS prioritize economic outcomes such as the humanitarian outcomes, right? And also those economic consequences besides this kind of intervention after they go inside the Niger, right? So on the other hand, while ECOWAS was also likely to carry about economic consequences than tangible political stability in the long run. The comparative is that AU care more about economic, AU care more about human outcomes over humanitarian outcomes and furthermore political stability because of the whole international monitoring gets far more larger within AU as a far more bigger international organization. With that being said, we think in terms of the outcomes and the aim of how they're able to intervene, AU gets far more better because it's aim on long-term political stability than just focusing on economic as consequences, which I think is very narrow in terms of the house. Directly we want to some rebuttals then. Firstly, in terms of this word of violence, 3 things to take this out. Firstly, we have solvency, letting the AU to deal with the political issues better than the economic organization because they know how to minimize costs on life and humanitarian level, and also AU is far more powerful in ECOWAS, where some of African countries is going to be excluded out of ECOWAS anyway. But secondly then, violence are become more severe in their side because the economic organization are likely to prioritize economic loss as they aim at economy, but not as the EU who prioritize political stability in the long run. Therefore, we're able to lower human costs from the very higher level. But thirdly, we also flip their case, letting AU to do the things is far more better because number one, Ellen told you about how they're linking political and politics better. Second, then AU is far more big, so more international monitoring and scrutiny. So if they do something bad with a nation, we have far more scrutiny and monitoring to make sure that the AU is truly intervening and solving the problem. But thirdly, AU is very justifiable to deal with political problems. This is something that also the DPM failed to engage with. We don't understand how an economic organization have the justification to actually intervene in other countries' political things within those countries anyway, right? But AU is a political organization which is justifiable to intervene and therefore helping to promote democracy. But fourthly, letting ECOWAS deal with this will have a lot of trade-offs. As other African countries will think that ECOWAS is a threat to sovereignty, therefore the economic net within this kind of African continent it is going to be weaker and therefore collapse. There's no tangible benefit that my partner already told you about trade and economic net in their side of the house. Which we think that ECOWAS, even if they're able to deal with this problem so better than AU, the consequences and the trade-off in terms of how breaking the economic is something that they never respond from the government side as a whole. Secondly, then, in terms of human rights violations, 2 responses towards those. Firstly, the neuron for this argument was based on 2 things. Firstly, military coup is bad. Secondly, then ECOWAS was able to solve the problem. So we think that we deal with them one by one. Firstly, military coup is bad. So this is something that both sides want to solve. We also want to overthrow the military coup. So this is a problem that both sides can solve. Secondly, then ECOWAS will actually solve the problem. There's no mechanization from the TM also to the DPM as to how the ECOWAS are able to address this problem far more effectively. Also, there's a burden for the DPM to prove the comparative. The question is, why is an economic organization a former better than dealing with political problems, former better than AU is far more powerful? Secondly, both sides want to overthrow military coup, which is why if the neuron is military coup, then we get to solve this human rights violations as well. But lastly, onto justification, 2 things to take this out. Firstly, their response to how ECOWAS is justifiable has no structural reasons. The DPM just said, look, ECOWAS are able to solve this problem because they have the responsibility to solve this problem. They're justified to solve this problem. But the problem comes is twofold. Firstly, AU have formal responsibility if the comparative is on the responsibility level. When AU is an organization, bring up the African continent together and form a big with a lot of international monitoring, international connection within it. We think that's why AU just far more responsible in dealing with political problems than an economic organization, which is to say the comparative on the responsibility level we outweigh. But second, responsibility doesn't really mean they're able to solve this problem very effectively. So there's a dialogue between what is responsible and how the social or the practical outcome is going to be. But secondly, they say ECOWAS show cowardness and therefore will actually lead into all of detrimental consequences. But the problem is that if AU don't do anything within this process, it symmetrically go to the harms of cowardness is symmetrically going to AU's reputation, right? So this is something more harmful because when ECOWAS is unable to solve huger problems than just within Niger, that's where we need AU to stand out and actually just solve this problem. But at that time, when AU does not do anything to intervene within Niger in this scenario, we think that that's where AU also loses authority. So if the comparative is on letting ECOWAS to lose authority or letting AU to lose authority, we would like to choose the third because we think that AU is far more qualified to deal with those problems. For all those reasons, opening
as a whole tries to discuss the principle of whether it is okay to militarily intervene and the harms of a military coup. That is something that they both agree on, right? As CG, we enter this debate focusing on the long-term and also external impact of Niger, not only the impact towards Niger as a country. Therefore, our stance is we believe that ECOWAS should intervene militarily in Niger and reinstate democracy. So before I bring three new extensions into this debate, I would like to provide some brief characterization. Niger is an impoverished and developing country which relies on loans and international support for development, as all developing countries do, right? Developing countries lack things like technology and are behind in many years. So international help towards Niger and being involved in international communication is uniquely important to developing countries like such. For military coups, their incentive is to hang on to power and are self-interested. In a military dictatorship, in contrast to a democracy, they do not actually have to represent the people's rights in order to stay in power. So even compared to a bad democracy where there are bad candidates, citizens still have the power to vote them out of office and protest against them in a peaceful manner. So we think the coup has far more power to be oppressive, even like compared to a bad democracy. Three main extensions that I'm going to bring into the debate then. First of all, on why you lose international support on their side of the house. Second of all, on like extending on deterrence, because we think that OG only briefly talked about this, but like doesn't actually touch on it and the impacts of it enough. But third of all, I think even if the coup looks representative now, why they're still bound to fail and harm Niger itself. So first of all, on our main extension of why Niger is going to lose international support on side op, right? I think the mechanism for this is like threefold, right? First of all, countries, especially more developed countries that are often richer and like have to provide these like loans and help, international help towards developing countries, lean against military coups because it violates democracies. Many of them, like for example, like America, which are democracies. But second of all, given that military coups incentive, as I've already extensively talked about in our characterization, since dictatorship doesn't actually need to represent citizens, you don't need to care about things like long-term development and international cooperation. I think these things are much more likely to be neglected on op side. But third of all, I think they're also incredibly likely to withdraw from important committees on international collaborations such as UN, which reduces its power in the global scale as well, right? But so the impact of this is a couple-fold. So first of all, I think countries are more likely to try to cut off trade, and stop loans, etc., in order to show that they don't support such military coups on op side of the house, which harms developing countries uniquely. But second of all, given that this military autocracy will sever its ties with several foreign countries and international organizations such as the US and lose supports, it's going to lose, for example, support for policies, trade, and the case of loans, right? What that results is slowed economic development of Niger, and it isolates it from both international support and other African countries at the same time. Moreover, we think that citizens also lose support from other countries, like funding for their infrastructure, with stagnating and worsened economy. So they're literally going to be stratified in this poverty. They'll become probably like a country like Cuba, right, where they're literally disconnected from the rest of the world. And this also uniquely impacts citizens because, furthermore, it lowers the standards of living and quality of life for Niger. But fourth of all, we also know that Niger, if they don't militarily intervene, they're likely to lose global power in case anything bad happens, right? For example, if climate change or something happens, they're not going to have the power to use their voice in the international scale and get help from other countries. Second point then, on the deterrence against military coup in other West African countries. I think the logic and mechanism for this is quite intuitive, right? When you don't intervene, other groups are probably more likely to stage coup for two reasons. First of all, it's not condemned and other countries aren't doing anything about it. I think that sends a message that this is okay and is still likely to be successful. But second of all, it shows that coups have succeeded before without external resistance, especially in areas that are volatile, like West Africa right now, right? The impact is it often reduces political stability, right? When you have a military coup, it often pushes people to be radical either for or against such ideas. But second of all, because that results in a lot of for example, citizens protesting, you also uniquely harm civilians because protest leads to fighting and are often very military coups are often very oppressive, which leads to no freedom for citizens. And third of all, as we've already talked about, and I think OG has already talked about, why there's going to be less democratization, which is uniquely bad because you have no freedom and the government doesn't actually serve citizens, right? So some weighing here on side op, even in our even in their best case scenario, there's just more violence in Niger, on our side, even in our worst case scenario, there's just more violence in Niger itself. But still, why are we willing to take that trade-off for less violence and more deterrence in other countries, right? Two reasons. First of all, I think we get less total violence because we just, in general, reduce the violence of military coups in other countries. But second of all, a lot of people in Niger have already suffered when the coup took over in the first place. So I think a military coup already brought a lot of bloodshed. So the impact that they have on their side is just minimal. So third extension then, I think even if the coup is bad for citizens, why this policy is still better. Coups in nature are autocratic and suppressive, as I've already told you, right? Also because dictatorships suppress freedom of speech and press. So for criticizing a military regime, for example, journalists are often abducted, detained. Therefore, I think because of the militarization of a country doing a coup, the citizens tend to live in constant fear and anxiety because they do not follow the rules and constitutions. The impact of this is a couple-fold, right? First of all, because military rulers don't care about the plight and demands of people, authorities are often given and must be adhered to eventually through the use of violence against people and ignoring things like sanctions that probably suggests that AU can do. My second speaker will extend on that later. But therefore, but also CEO talks about how poor people probably don't care about democracy. But we flip that by saying I'd argue that it's probably poor people that would care the most about democracy because in military coups they aren't actually able to change the status quo in the first place. Well, on our side, at least you're able to change those things and at least fight for your have a vote to fight, right? Therefore, third impact, I think human rights such as the freedom of speech, expression, and association will be heavily abused. That opening already talked about. But even if we are charitable, in our side when the democracy is really bad, people can at least overthrow it without violence and rely on foreign funds. So uniquely, in case CEO brings an alternative quickly on why only does militarization in this case work. And to deal with OO, my whip speaker will tell you why uniquely militarization by this organization is the best solution. First of all, I think militarization is quicker than other methods, right? We've already proved to you why this is an urgent issue on democracy, just like OG says as well. So in comparison to, for example, a peace treaty that will take much longer because of negotiations, I think a military coup is much quicker and achieves our intentions in a better way. But second of all, the only way to intimidate a military coup itself is to use military means to match that, because military coups are the most powerful aspect about them is their military ability, hence the name, right? Because it gives them the ability to not care about citizens' opinions through the use of violence. So therefore, I think we need to match that military power in order to them intimidate them to step down in the first place. So in this speech, I've uniquely brought to you the long-term impact brought to Niger, and we analyze both multiple scenarios of this coup failing or not. For all these reasons above, proud to propose.
So in this debate, we'll be talking briefly about the utilitarian benefit in the democracy, and we'll be justifying a little bit on why a military coup isn't bad and as bad and harmful as government characterizes, and why it is crucial in this time for a country such as Niger. And we'll also be talking about how on our side of the house we will lead to more long-term democracy. And we'll be justifying why we believe that we should have utilitarian benefit over democracy in this time. So first off, before we begin, we would like to point out a couple of things, right? We will point out that our opening half points out the fact that they want to depend on the AU to lend a helping hand, right? We believe that they should be out of opening opposition should be out of this debate by the fact that they spend the time solely focusing their efforts on saying that AU is going to contribute to this, because we say that the African Union will absolutely not, because of two things. One, we believe that a lot of countries in the African Union are literally military dictatorship, so we don't think they would see anything wrong with the fact that there is a military dictatorship and coup. There are a lot of members in the African Union, and so much that we believe they cannot come to a consensus and come to a point where they are willing to take actions on Niger. okay, now that that's out, that wipes out basically a lot of their points. But also, we believe that in this debate, we should also win over, because we'll be giving you the unique extension on about the people and about the country Niger itself, and not just talking about ECOWAS, because we believe that ECOWAS is not the most important stakeholder in this case. We believe that the most important stakeholder in this debate should be Niger and the people inside of Niger who will be suffering the consequences of these military interventions, right? So first off, we would like to give a couple of responses to the previous speakers from the opening bench. So opening government tells us that basically, we would be sending a bad message, and that it would be like sending a message to other countries that they are allowed to basically coup just because Niger is couping first. No, two things. Number one, they cannot be used as example, because the reason that a coup has happened in Niger is because of devastating situation that Niger is in, as categorized by the hosting government, and as that we concede to, is the fact that Niger is a country that is has a lot of terrorist groups. It's literally dying because of warfare, and has a low quality of living for the people and a lot of poverty, right? So this means that the coup has to happen in order to ensure that these terrorist groups do not keep fighting amongst themselves and create even more problems internally within the country. No, thank you. And we believe that most countries already have an incentive not to support a coup, because there are already global eyes on most countries. And if you were a decently established countries with a decently established system, it would not be easy to randomly just coup up. And you would also face a lot of backlash if you were to coup up in a country with no internal problems that is in need of a coup. So we believe that that is already justifiable in itself. And they talk about how basically, like people should, like, the government should not do this because there's an incentive to like support democracy, right? So I'm just going to justify this with our argument on why we believe that utilitarian benefits overweigh democracy in this debate, right? So we believe that as important as democracy is, we believe that in Niger, democracy is not going to be the most functional thing as of right now, because one, right, democracy runs on a good functional vote, right? And one, Niger is a country with relatively low education rates, which means people are not going to be able to make the most informed decisions. And two, coercion. People, like, notice that there are a lot of terrorist groups and there's a lot of powers in Niger, and people may not be able to have a fair vote because the system within Niger for them to vote and cast and elect a government is still not very stable because of the situation that the country is in. And two, right, notice that Niger itself already has a lot of internal conflicts, right? So this means that they are already fighting within the country, and people already live their life every day feeling unsafe enough. Like there's already enough problems, and like they need to. Okay, I'll take it, POI.
Okay, so you said that the people of Niger feel unsafe before the coup. So how is their life gonna become any safer after the coup?
Their life is safer because of the coup. Is because one, right? Because the military coup, even though they're like a coup, there's still a military, so at least there's still an established group, right? And they still have some certain level of credibility over ISIS or other terrorist groups within the country in Niger, right? And also note, right, that these terrorist groups, right, they do not have any moral obligation to follow most of the more moral code of conduct. Well, because of the military coup, the military still have some code of conduct, some code of law, and some moral obligation to the citizen. And notice that because they are a military, right, they also have some loyalty to the country that is literally in the code of the no, thank you. That is literally in the code of conduct and functioning, right? And they also have, and also we believe that if a military were so bad and if they were so horrible that they would abuse their citizens and violate every human right violation, be like so terrible as like government has mentioned, notice that there are global eyes and there are organizations that such as the ICJ, and also notice that there are social media and many check and balances that serve in today's world that would totally absolutely speak up about this and not let this happen. Because notice, panel, we do not live in a world where people are no longer able to spread awareness about these issues, and people would actually speak out about these issues, right? But what we're saying is because there is so many problems in Niger right now, right? A centralized government such as the military coup works better because it makes things faster. They can manage things easier because they have power and force and mobility to actually combat these terrorist groups, number one. And number two is because they have the power to actually move things. This looks like they have the power to actually move things toward a lighter, toward the direction easier, because as we have both characterize the military people are very like they are very like, you know, they have more force, power, and mobility. So that this allows them to actually like be able to improve the quality of education and like establish more infrastructure easier than because this can happen because they can combat these military groups and these warfare groups and minimize the damage of warfare and the damage of terrorist groups within the country, which allows those developments to take place, right? However, on their side of the house, if they let ECOWAS or other groups intervene in, right, this is going to create even more problems because the military government is not going to agree because they feel like they should still have a level of control, and because they understand that these terrorist groups are, if they are unable to stay in control and stop these terrorist groups are going to rise up. And we believe that the military realizes that we're still at an unstable place, and because of this, the military group is likely not going to surrender, and this is going to cause more warfare, right? And more warfare would mean even more horrible living conditions and even more horrible lives for the citizens who are already suffering, right? And we would like to weigh that even in the worst case scenario where it's a fast warfare where ECOWAS is able to win against these military, it would still cause a lot of democratic establishments, and problem of terrorism is still not fixed, right? Even if it's a prolonged warfare, then that's even worse because then these countries are going to fight for even longer, and it's going to create horrible qualities of living for both ECOWAS and the Niger country.
First, I'd like to note that there's literally no engagement coming from CO on our case, and they have not even mentioned our points in their case. Therefore, we assume that our case still stands strong because we get no sorts of response here. Now we're going to move on to why our extension wins the debate, and we're going to start with closing opposition. Closing opposition largely lacks mechanism and gives you these kind of titles of utilitarian benefits, long-term benefits, without actually mechanizing how these kind of benefits will rise, and because they literally fail to take down how we give you these structural opposition and structural barriers that oppressive governments literally cannot cross because they have not rebutted this. Their long-term benefits that they claim are not like null here. They also talk about how there'll be utilitarian benefits. First, this is unmechanized and linked, while we have given you the mechanism of how oppressive governments will always inevitably fail the citizens. There's an urgency, instead, we have suggested that for Niger to maintain international relationship as an impoverished developing country. They also talk about how there's low education in Niger. We believe that this can only be helped through international relationships and international help from UN, which we believe that we have already mechanized, that how these kind of coups will cut them off from, and their long-term solution is unsustainable. More on that later. They also talk about how military people, these kind of military coups will be much more efficient in developing infrastructure and establishing policies. We believe that this is just completely untrue. There's nothing that actually incentivizes these military leaders, which all of the houses have characterized as more kind of selfish and self-interested, to align with what the citizens need, and they don't take down how repressive nature isn't there, and how military coups will actually be incentivized to make these changes in the first place and create the infrastructures for the citizens. We don't see how this efficiency even matters in this debate. They also talk about the bad impact of warfare, right? They say that we believe that violence is worse when these coups turn on its citizens, oppress them, take their human rights from them. We believe that this is far worse than this warfare solving this and reinstating this democracy here, right? We believe that these kind of violent coups cling on to their power, and eventually when this becomes incredibly bad for the citizens, violence is inevitably necessary to overtake these kind of governments. They also talked about how coups are needed to stop coercion and terrorism. We literally don't understand why coups stop terrorists. We believe that terrorists are often motivated by anger and irrational things and things like mental illness. We believe that they're literally willing to sacrifice their lives in order to achieve their goals. Hence, we don't think that the change of government is going to make them want to stop. And there will always be people who feel like they are the victims, and terrorism will still exist. And we think that in the best case scenario, there will be just fighting military oppression of these terrorist organizations, and they'll be just constant fighting. We flip it by saying that it gets worse there. When military coups happen, they're also very militarily inclined. Wouldn't military coups, whose strongest advantage is literally their military, fight back against this terrorist group with military action? This directly contradicts their stance on how more warfare is bad. We believe that with military coups, warfare is inevitable. Now let's move on to opening opposition. We believe that OO here has an incredibly soft stance that is dependent on them proving that economic organizations shouldn't intervene. Now, as long as we prove that it is important for ECOWAS to intervene, aligned with ECOWAS goals and responsibilities, their entire case and rebuttals are rendered invalid. They first talk about how economic community should not be involved. ECOWAS' major concern is to promote cooperation, higher standards of living, and economic stability in Africa. We believe that it is completely justified for ECOWAS to join this issue, and it is their responsibility. As in developing countries, political stability and international relations are highly involved in their economic aspects. In developing countries, they need foreign loans, transfer of technology from other international superpowers in order for their economy to persist. And we believe that coups directly intervene with this by enduring long-term economic development. And we also have proven to you how coups will cause chain effects in the African continent. Thus, we have proven to you why ECOWAS it is really important to join. Not right now. They also talk about how AU should deal with it. First of all, like OG and CG said, this is completely irrelevant to this debate. This debate is about whether there should be military intervention or not. Given that ECOWAS is always dealing with this issue in the present, I think all of the other three teams agree. So OO should be out of this debate already. Even if we're charitable, we believe that they literally misunderstand and overestimated the power of AU. It is literally like the African United Nation and is only made to encourage cooperation. And we believe that the African Union's power extends to the fact that they only have ASF peacekeepers and don't actually have the ability to take full military actions, right? We believe that their power only pertains to things like economic sanctions and discussions like the United Nations. And this clearly doesn't work for dictatorship because they don't really need to care about a representation of citizens, and they don't really care about economic sanctions. Interested, not right now, stop bothering me. So it is much harder to intervene on their side. You need a consensus or at least a majority vote on their side, and given that there are much more countries in Africa, it is harder to achieve that vote. Therefore, this is very infeasible, especially since ECOWAS is already dealing with this. They also talk about the undermining of trust and deterring people from joining. We believe that continents are not really considered in terms of a thing like trade. For Japan, South Korea, and China are part of the same subdivision of Asia, yet because political differences, they all trade with very different countries. Only in cases such as Southeast Asia, where all countries have similar political stances, is the economic considered in an entire region. And they talk about how it is not moral for ECOWAS to intervene in Niger. We believe that we're already taken down. However, we also they wrongly tell you that Niger was not in ECOWAS, which ECOWAS clearly contains all West African countries. Furthermore, organizations have a moral obligation to uphold peace and stability and reduce harm and take actions in order to ensure economic stability, which is literally what ECOWAS is made for. Lastly, OG's argument is very minimal and not important compared to us. While the opening only touches briefly on the principle of the importance of democracy and freedom and human rights, and entitled The Deterrence on West African Countries, we on a side who provide you with more layers of mechanism on how deterrence actually happen, how they work, and the impact that they yield. We also give you clear practical points as well as why people like Niger need and rely on international help that a military coup will cut them off from. We not only tell you that even if it is our worst case scenario, a bad democracy is far more better than a military coup for its potential right now, but also it is likely to impact them in the future through indirect means, such as keeping them out of international relations if a coup rises. So proud to propose.
The sides that are arguing for military intervention fail to recognize that military intervention is never certain. In the case of the US in Afghanistan, where the US had F-15 fighter jets and the Afghanis or the Taliban only had AK-47 and very rudimentary weapons, the US lost. In Ukraine, Russia thought it would be a couple weeks. Now they're mired in a years-long war. Military intervention is never never certain in real life. And that is why all their benefits do not materialize whatsoever. Okay, a couple rebuttals. Their main point and their main impact is that Niger, the invasion of Niger by ECOWAS will be used to prevent further coups in Africa. It'll be used to prevent the domino effect of like military coups in Africa. First off, they don't recognize that it's already a common trend in West Africa that there are a lot of military coups, and one intervention is not going to stop this decades-long trend that's already happening due to like bad colonial borders. But second off, we say that it is principally unjustified to do this because essentially they're using the citizens of Niger, the simple people of Niger who are suffering under like this state of terrorism and insurgencies in their country as a means to an end. They're using these people as a means to like show other like military leaders in other countries not to commit coups, and this is principally unjustified. They should not be using the people of Niger. But second off, this benefit does not accrue because it's not guaranteed that these militaries will be successful. As we defined before, like West Africa is generally like in general, they're a poor region. You know, like most countries in West Africa are dealing with their own insurgencies. They're not dealing with that. They're dealing with Ebola outbreaks. They're dealing with being able to feed their own like populations. So why does the other side think they'll suddenly be able to be militarily capable enough to like properly invade Niger, which is a country of like thousands and thousands of square kilometers? Like that is just simply like not the case. They haven't justified why this will be swiftly, which is their best case scenario. And also, this is bad because when countries invade Niger, they aren't taking into consideration that when their troops leave their own country, because West Africa is already an extremely unstable region, when this happens, because the region is unstable, the troops have left, like it's more likely for a coup to happen in these countries. So like even in the country's best interest, the members of ECOWAS, which are not Niger, like it's also in their best interest to like not invade ECOWAS. When your house is on fire, don't save your neighbor, save yourself first. Okay, so furthermore, on the rebuttals, what do we talk about? So the other side has attacked us on like, oh, is Niger gonna get democracy? What will the future of Niger be in this case? And we're saying the bottom line is, even though Niger depends on aid, there's also like a lot of military insurgencies. There's a lot of like ethnic violence within Niger. And the fact that in the immediate future, the military, because they're a dictatorship, because they are more centralized in this regard, because it is a time of crisis, a time of dire crisis for the nation of Niger, they're more readily able to put out these fires because they're more centralized. They're more readily able to put out these fires because they have a background in like being in the military. But in the future, it is also very clear that democracy, a proper form of democracy, is more likely to arise with Niger, because the only way democracies can be stable is if the citizens are properly educated, the citizens have proper jobs, and there is stability within the nation. There is not division in the nation. Once this happens, this is a prerequisite for democracy, and democracy will come to Niger. And yes, okay. After this, I'll be analyzing the best and worst case scenarios for side government. So side government doesn't really do a lot to justify why their invasion will be quick and swiftly. So I think the most likely outcome of this is like there will be a long war within Niger. And the bottom line is the people, like war is worse than any sort of economic hardship that Niger can face, because in war, your life is threatened every single day. You don't know if you will survive until tomorrow, especially in a large-scale war like what happened in Niger. Plus, this is exacerbated by the fact that there are already insurgencies in Niger. So like this will be like two sides attacking the citizens of Niger, and they won't really have a way out. But in the best case scenario, when if these West African countries are somehow able to topple the government of Niger, what do we say? We say that in West Africa, it's not like democracy is like a strong tradition. You know, it's not like these other countries of West Africa are pillars of democracy. It's not like these countries rampant corruption. It's not like these other countries aren't basically just military dictatorships themselves. So how do we expect these countries to be all like willy-nilly on their high horse going like, oh, Niger should have a democracy. We are going to set up this democracy for you once we kick out the insurgencies, once we kick out these coup leaders. So this is clearly not true. Okay, I'll take the POI now.
Okay, you said that democracy is not a strong tradition in Africa. Well, I like to say that democracy is actually very valued in Africa because Africa has suffered for many decades under the colonial power. So democracy is actually
yes. Okay, okay. I understand you. I'm saying it is not a strong tradition in Africa, as in it has not been exercised in Africa to a very great degree, both in quantity and in the quality of democracy. That is why we shouldn't have ECOWAS propping up democratic regimes in these countries. That's simply like not good. Okay, let's go to the bottom line of this debate. The bottom line of this debate is, one, the countries in ECOWAS aren't in a position to invade Niger. Two, the citizens of Niger need stability. They need stability from these insurgencies. They need stability from more change of government. And it is not clear why these military dictatorships are going to be the worst case scenario, are going to be like, you know, like Mao Zedong and like the Great Leap Forward are going to like mass murder millions of people. Like, it's not clear why this is definitely the case. The bottom line is we don't want more harm for the citizens of Niger. And their harms on the domino effect are very unclear. There are many holes in their case. Please vote closing opposition. Thank you.